Demon Kissed, Chapter 4. Alistair's infuriated roar vibrated in the air a second later, and then his power flared across the night, making my skin burn as his power danced over my flesh. Then the power coalesced around my body and sent me flying sideways through the air, down the alley and shoulders first into the side of a dumpster. The force of the hit snapped my head back, and the back of my head crashed into the dumpster with enough force to blacken my vision for a second. Dazed, I lost my already tenuous concentration, and the hold I had on Alistair broke, rebounding onto me and causing pain to explode violently behind my eyes. I groaned and lay where I was for a bit to assess my injuries. I had known that doing something like that would piss him off, but damn. I hadn't accounted for the strength of his power, and I was now paying for that miscalculation in spades. Discovering that nothing was broken, to my immense relief, I slowly pushed myself into a sitting position and then leaned back against the dumpster to regain my equilibrium. The pain in my head intensified briefly, and the alley spun around me for a moment. Bile rose, and swallowing it back, I briefly closed my eyes. I didn't hear or sense anything to indicate that Alistair had moved, but when I opened my eyes again, he was standing over me, a thunderous expression on his face, his eyes glowing a bright red tinted silver with rage. Damn, he's cute even when he's pissed off to hell and back, my dazed mind said, and I pushed the errant thought away with difficulty. I looked away from his face and to the ground. You dared to attack me? Are you mad, woman? Have you no sense? Here, Alistair said, white-hot anger riding his voice, and I winced as the sound reverberated through my skull. His power still rode the air around me, licking like little flames along my skin and making my hair stand on end. His eyes were completely red when I risked another glance up at him. Ignoring his question and the hand he offered me, I tried to stand on my own, using the dumpster for support. Once I was upright, my legs wobbled, then gave out under my weight, and sent me back down to the ground in an undignified heap. There I sat, my knees under me, and the lower half of my legs spread to either side of my butt. The world was spinning again, and I leaned forward slightly as nausea threatened. Breathing slowly and deeply through my mouth, I tried not to vomit. My head hurt so bad right now that I couldn't see straight, and I was seeing double of everything. 2 pairs of boots, 2 sets of knees. God, my breathing trick wasn't working. I was going to throw up. I scrambled sideways to avoid Alistair's nice boots as my stomach heaved. When I was finished emptying my stomach of what little I had eaten tonight, I collapsed onto my side and curled into a little ball, my muscles still twitching and shaking uncontrollably. Gah, kill me, I said, when I could speak again. Throwing up had made the pain in my head blinding, and I didn't dare move for fear of being sick again. The cold winter wind swept down the alley, making me shiver as it touched the exposed, sweaty skin on my neck and face. I have told you before, and I'll tell you again. I do not wish to kill you, Alistair said chidingly. I cracked open an eye and saw him beside me. His eyes had darkened to pewter with concern, the anger of moments ago gone. And he was kneeling well away from the spot I had thrown up. Amusement briefly warmed me over the distance he was keeping from it. Just kill me, Alistair, and get it over with. I'm sure death by your hand would be better than drowning in vomit, I said, and closed my eye again. He chuckled, and I felt his cool fingers brush the strands of sweaty hair off of the side of my face. I batted weakly at his hand, and moaned when the movement shot more pain through my poor abused head. I'm going to pick you up and move you out of this alley, Malone, he said, then slid his arms under my shoulders and knees, lifting me gently and easily up into the cradle of his arms. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself gazing up into his eyes again. For a moment he just held me like that against his chest, and looked back at me, his gaze searching. Then he smiled faintly and set off down the alley. My stomach made threatening movements, and my head protested any sort of movement at all. I couldn't control the need to throw up again, and turned slightly in his arms, though at this point I was pretty sure there was nothing left in my stomach to throw up. He stopped walking as I dry-heaved and murmured soothingly to me. When I was done, darkness edged my vision, and my mind was flirting with unconsciousness. He shifted his hold on me, and the flirting became fact as my awareness of what was going on floated away on a black tide of unconsciousness. It wasn't exactly sleep, but it would do. Awareness returned to me in stages. First was the awareness of a lot of time having passed. Then I became aware of voices speaking softly around me, and then I had the sensation of being moved again. Being moved caused distant flares of pain in my back and skull, and darkness claimed me again. The voices came again, louder this time, and I tensed, then relaxed as the resonance of the voices became clear. The question was I still outside, or was I home? Or perhaps Alistair's home? Why that thought made me giddy, I don't know. "And that's where you found her scent? You're sure?" one voice asked, its familiar demonic tone lending me comfort. "Yeah, I don't know what caused her to go there, though. There's nothing there except old warehouses," another voice answered. This voice, too, lended comfort with its young and growling familiarity. I opened my eyes, and the familiar sight of greenish-tan canvas above me was just as comforting as the voices. I was home then. Well, home of the moment, anyway. "Hey, you're awake," the first voice said. I turned my head carefully to the left and smiled a bit. "So I am, Isaac," I said, my voice a dry croak of sound, and fought off a cough. "We weren't sure if you were going to wake up," the second voice said, and I shifted my gaze from Isaac to the speaker. "Sorry I gave you guys a scare, Gregory," I said, and carefully rolled onto my side. He smiled slightly and came over to the cot on which I lay, pushing Isaac, who was much larger, out of his way. Gregory sat down carefully beside me on the side of the cot and grabbed my hand, squeezing it lightly. The gesture, along with the fear still evident in his amber eyes, had my own eyes clouding with tears and my throat tightening painfully with them. "If you ever die on us, I don't know what we would do," he said, his voice little more than a low growl. I squeezed his hand and looked past him to Isaac for help. "I don't think she intends to leave us any time soon, pup," Isaac said, laying a comforting hand on his shoulder. Gregory looked at him for a moment, then nodded and climbed over me to curl his large, lanky frame around my smaller, slighter one, his arms going around my waist, his knees tucked behind mine, face tucked into the crook of my neck under my hair. A shudder shook his body, and a low howl echoed in his chest. I closed my eyes and hugged his arms closer around me with one arm. Gregory had only been 3 when I had found him 9 years ago, on the steps of what used to be a church in the middle of a blizzard. He was now 12, and though he looked older due to his size, he was still just a kid. One who still needed a mom, and like it or not, I had become that for him when I was 17. I was a mother to Gregory and several other children I had found abandoned in the streets, and over the years I had become used to being there for them and having them depend on me for comfort and protection. The kids had become my family, my home, and the only real hope I still had. Isaac cleared his throat, and I opened my eyes to look at him. His eyes glowed eerily in the shadows cast over his face by the half-light of the lantern, and for a moment he looked nothing like my beloved friend. I felt a faint chill of fear and brushed it aside as the shadows vanished. "Care to tell me what happened?" he asked, crouching down next to the cot and taking my free hand in both of his much larger ones. His slightly demonic features looked pinched with weariness, and his yellow-orange eyes were bloodshot. I took my other hand from Gregory's arms and placed it on Isaac's cheek. He leaned into my touch and closed his eyes. I smiled slightly and ran my thumb over his cheekbone for a moment. "Not right now, Isaac, my friend. Maybe later," I said, smoothing his coarse black hair from his face. His eyes blinked open, and his slit pupils contracted into tiny black lines that were barely discernible from the color of the rest of his eyes, a sure sign that he was annoyed. "I just couldn't make any of the men in my life happy this week, it seems," I thought, and sighed, letting my hand drop back to the cot as I held his gaze. He sighed after a moment and looked away. I looked away too, and placed my hand back on Gregory's arms. "You know, I just want to know what caused your injuries," he said after a moment. "My own stupidity and inability to control one of my gifts," I thought, but didn't say. "You, my friend, worry too much," I said firmly, looking back to him, then added, "But I will tell you what happened, just not right now. Right now, what I need is food and a little more rest. Maybe some morphine or other type of painkiller, too," I added in my head. "You had a concussion, a severe one, and you were unconscious through what remained of last night and almost all friggin' day today as well," he said, looking at me fiercely, then added, "If you don't want to tell me what happened right now, then at least tell me who did the damage." I sighed again and stroked Gregory's arms gently as I thought about what had happened yesterday. "Alistair," I said, a little self-frustration slipping into my voice, and he blinked at me for a moment. His expression would have been funny if what I'd done didn't bother me. "Alistair? But I thought he liked you," Isaac said, confusion coloring his tone. "Why would he attack you, Mom?" "Uncle Isaac's right. That vamp likes you," Gregory said. "Liking someone doesn't mean you won't hurt them if they attack you first," I said, chuckling a little sadly as I recalled the look on Alistair's face after he slammed into that wall. He probably wouldn't want anything to do with me after that, I thought sadly. Gregory's arms tensed around me, and I stroked them until they relaxed again. "Why did you attack Alistair?" Isaac asked, and Gregory made an inquiring sound behind me. "He pinned me to a wall and tried to kiss me," I said, and looked away from Isaac again. "But I wouldn't think a little kiss a very good reason to attack the man," he said. "Need I remind you that he is one of the undead?" I asked, repeating a line from a book I had read once, and looking at him again. As an excuse, it sucked. As a cover for my own cowardice, though, it worked just fine, and I knew he wouldn't question it. "I still don't see why you would attack him over something as simple as a kiss," he said. "Nothing about that vampire is simple, Isaac. There never has been and never will be anything simple about him. Besides, he wouldn't have stopped at just a kiss last night," I said, then added, patting Gregory's arms, "Let me up, Greg. I need to pee." His arms tightened briefly again. Then he let me sit up. The world spun a bit when I sat up, but after a moment it settled and stayed still. I carefully slid my legs all the way over the side of the cot to the floor, and then just as carefully stood up. My legs wobbled, and Isaac reached out to steady me, his arm going around my shoulders. After a bit my legs steadied, and I could stand without help. Isaac sort of hovered behind me as I put on my boots and left the tent, ready to catch me should I topple over. I looked around our camp and shivered from the cold air that held the promise of snow. Winter was starting, and it was the beginning of June. 13 years ago, we had the beginning of summer this time of year, but now winter came at the beginning of the summer months. The North and South Poles had moved to east and west, causing the entire ecosystem to alter to the point that the weather had changed drastically, and up until 3 years ago, it had snowed year-round. A mini ice age, some people had called it. Personally, I didn't care what they had called it. I was just glad that it was over and that in a few months' time it would be warm again. I looked south and saw the pinks, reds, and purples of sunset beginning to paint the overcast sky. Another beautiful sunset, and no one special to share it with any more, I thought, feeling my chest tighten painfully as I stood there remembering Lucy. Then I shook it off and started across the pavement. "Where are the other kids?" I asked Isaac as I headed toward the building that had once been a Kmart, and tried not to think too hard about what had happened last night with Alistair, or what I'd been doing in his territory yesterday before Isaac had met up with me. "In bed, or they should be, anyway. The kids stayed in our tent nearly the entire time you were unconscious, until I sent them off to get some rest an hour ago," he said, catching my arm when I slid on a patch of ice, and I muttered a low curse as his grip put pressure on a bruise. He released me as soon as I was steady again, and I picked my way toward the building with more caution as we continued walking. "I have to head out again tomorrow, Isaac. The food we have won't last much longer, and I have some unfinished business in the warehouse district," I said, thinking that I at least owed Alistair an apology. "You need to stay home and finish healing, Aaron," he said, censure in his tone. I shook my head slightly and winced. My head was still pretty sore from its collision with the dumpster, and if I wasn't damn careful in the future, I'd end up with more than just a headache and a few bruises. "We need food, more than I need rest, and the streets won't patrol themselves. Besides, I will be careful," I said, stepping through the smashed front doors of the building. The wind howled through the broken glass, and I shivered from the cold as it blasted me from behind. Looking around, I noted that the older kids had almost finished scavenging the building, and nodded. "You're only human, Aaron. You're going to get yourself killed out there if you keep this up," he said. "Maybe, but we still need food and a warmer place to stay with winter coming. Besides, I'm the only licensed hunter left in Outer City, and you know it," I said, picking my way past parts of the collapsed ceiling and destroyed registers to the restroom area. He growled at me in frustration and said, "At least take me with you when you go, so you won't be alone out there this time." I looked over my shoulder at him and smiled. Friends like Isaac were hard to find and even harder to keep around. "Fine. I need someone to watch my back while I'm scouting," I said, and shrugged. He nodded, and I ducked into a bathroom stall. When I emerged a few minutes later, Isaac had a pensive look on his face, and his eyes had a distant cast to them. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, and he blinked, looking at me. "Nothing much, just planning for winter. We'll need warmer blankets and clothes," he said after a long moment of just looking at me. His answer was reasonable enough, but the words sounded clipped, and I suspected that it hadn't been the whole truth. As I couldn't prove my suspicion without reading his mind, however, I just nodded and stepped past him, thinking that I should have thought of winter preparations 3 months ago, when the fall had started to creep in on us. But Cap and the others had still been alive 3 months ago, and I hadn't had to think about it. Now I had to think about it, and I knew suitable shelter would be hard enough to find, let alone enough food, blankets, and clothes for everyone. Sighing heavily as the weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a boulder, I walked back to the tent I shared with Isaac. I guess I got so used to Cap and the others thinking of this kind of stuff that I just forgot it needed done, I mused, lifting the door flap. Upon entering the tent, I saw Gregory curled up in a ball in the middle of my cot and fast asleep with his nose buried in my pillow. "Isaac?" I said softly, making his name a question as I stepped to the side of the tent flap. "Yeah, Aaron?" he said, coming in behind me. "I think I'll be bunking in your bed with you," I said wryly when he stopped beside me and stared at my kid-filled bed, his expression becoming pained. Then he looked at me and said, "Can't you sleep on the floor?" His tone was pleading, and his eyes were filled with a kind of soft horror at the thought of sleeping next to me. I laughed softly, then said, "Go get the spare cot. I'll sleep on it, unless Bailey ate her bed again and we don't have a spare any more." He bolted out of the tent with a hasty promise that he would bring it if we still had it, and if not, whatever spare blankets we had. Shaking my head and chuckling, I went over to my cot and pulled the heavy blanket up to cover Gregory's sleeping form, then gently brushed his hair away from his face. He stirred and mumbled sleepily, "Night, Mom." Then he settled into sleep again. "Night, precious pup," I whispered, and placed a gentle kiss on his forehead. Smiling, I went over to Isaac's cot and sat down. The kerosene lamp hanging from a hook on the ceiling of the tent cast flickering shadows in Gregory's silver-blonde hair, lending it a golden color, and I compared it to the way his wolf form had looked in sunlight 3 months ago when he shifted in the middle of base and scared the crap out of the other hunters. Chuckling a bit at the memory, I looked at his face and frowned a little. Even in repose, he looked far older than he really was. Far older than he should, in fact, and it wasn't just his size that made him seem that way either, I realized suddenly. Faint lines of worry marred his once smooth brow, making him look closer to my age than 12, and I wondered if by moving camp as often as I did over the last month and a half had somehow put those lines on his face, or if it was my leaving every day that had caused them. If the constant worry that today might be the day that I too didn't come home had made him look like that. Isaac came back into the tent carrying the spare cot, and I looked at him closely. He looked worn and tired, lines of worry etched into his otherwise smooth obsidian skin. We needed a permanent place to stay, where we could rest and would be able to defend easily if we got attacked again, I thought. Maybe my folks' house? God knew my dad had put in enough security on the place to give Knox a run for all its gold, and I'd made some modifications to all of it over the last few years. The only problem with that idea was that the house was in one of those gated communities uptown, and there were still a lot of nosy people that lived there. Worry and frustration began eating at my mind, and I studied Isaac's tired face again as he moved to begin setting up the cot he'd brought back. "Isaac, am I doing the right thing, keeping us on the move like I do?" I asked quietly, as he set up the spare cot at the back of the tent near his, and I saw his shoulders stiffen a bit. "What makes you ask that?" he asked, looking over his shoulder at me. "No real reason, just wondering. I mean, the attacks have finally stopped, and we don't have to keep moving every freaking day," I said mildly, getting up and going over to help him. "There was a note in your voice that says you are worried about something," he said, pushing the last brace into place, then added as he partly straightened, "and that something made you ask the question. Now spill." I moved to a crate near the front of the tent and retrieved a heavy quilt. "I am worried about whether or not we're going to find proper shelter," I said after a moment, shrugging, and tossed the quilt on his cot for the moment. "That is not what made you ask if you were doing the right thing by moving us around," he said, and snorted like a horse. I sighed. Unfortunately, Isaac knew me too well by now to be put off by a statement like that. one that I had just put out there. We'd been friends for 10 years now, and it would have surprised me if he didn't know me as well as he did by now. Shrugging again, I decided to tell him the truth about some of what was bugging me. Okay, I guess what I'm really worried about is that if by moving the camp as much as I do, I'm putting too much stress on you and the kids. I mean, look at Gregory, I said, waving my hand at the boy. Isaac looked over at him, then looked back at me and shook his head. It's not the moving that's caused him to look as old as he does, he said, and flicked a thin blanket over the cot, then proceeded to straighten it with a focus that was kind of scary to witness. So it's my leaving every day that's caused him to look like that? I asked, snagging a spare pillow from the trunk at the foot of Isaac's bed, and grabbed the quilt. He nodded, shook his head, then smiling ruefully, he glanced at me and shrugged a bit sheepishly. Whichever it is, I'm sure you'll tell me when you figure it out, I said, tossing the pillow and quilt onto the cot, then watched as he duck-walked over to where Gregory was snoring quietly on my old cot. A tender, caring smile curved his lips as he bent forward a little more and placed a light kiss on the top of the boy's hair. Isaac was still bent almost entirely in half when he came back over to his cot, so he didn't hit his head on the lantern or put another hole in the top of the tent. We'd run out of duct tape to fix any more holes in the roof. He was 2.5 feet taller than I was, and that had proved problematic in the past, as the patches in the ceiling could attest, and though he could shrink his size, he never did unless he had to. Since he mostly stayed behind at camp with the kids, his refusal to shift bothered me a bit, but not enough to bug him about it tonight. Smiling slightly, I moved to the lantern and said, "Good night, Isaac," then blew out the light, plunging the tent into darkness. "Good night, Aaron," he said, the creak of his cot indicating that he had lain down. Outside the tent, the wind picked up, and the outside temperature dropped further. I crawled into my new cot, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly and gave me plenty of time to think about finding a permanent place for us to live that wasn't uptown. The west side of the warehouse district might work as a permanent base, or perhaps the east side of the business district would work better, I thought, just before sleep claimed me. Several hours later, I was awake again and getting ready to head out with Isaac on our recon mission. Dressed in a pair of worn-out cargo pants, a long-sleeved black t-shirt, camouflage vest, and high-heeled, steel-toed combat boots, I searched the tent for my jacket and SWAT-style helmet. After 10 minutes of looking, I found the knife I had dropped 2 nights ago and had thought was lost forever, but not the jacket I'd worn or the helmet I'd dropped. After another 5 minutes of looking for them, I gave up, tied my hair back, and looked at Gregory. All the kids had been in the tent this morning, and the youngest ones were trying to get Isaac and me to take them with us, and for the last 15 minutes, while I looked for the rest of my gear, I had been telling them no in one form or another. Most of the older kids had gone off to get their chores done like good little hellspawn, but the youngest ones were persistent little buggers and were still in the tent trying to get us to take them. "Now remember, Greg, you, Raven, and Michelangelo are in charge until we get back," I said, and he nodded. "Please make sure that Raven takes his meds, okay? I don't want to come back home and find him catatonic again because he forgot to take them," I added, and he looked down at the floor for a long moment before nodding again. "Mama, take me with you," 4-year-old Derek yelled, and I winced as the high pitch of his voice echoed through my still aching head. Did it make me a bad mother to want to beat the hell out of him and leave him on Fifth for the hyenas? I wondered, and my 4th oldest daughter looked at me sharply. I'd have to keep a closer eye on Miss Shayla in the future, it seemed, or censor every thought in my head, and doing that would get real old real fast. Ricky, I can't. You need to stay here and listen to your big brothers Greg, Michael, and Raven, I said for what felt like the 2000th time this morning, and reminded myself that if I hadn't taken him in 2 years ago, he'd probably be dead now. I'd also still have all of my sanity, I mused, and snorting at my thoughts, added, Who needed to be sane these days anyway? I'm better off nuts. I bent down, gave him a quick hug, and straightening, I gave Gregory a kiss on the cheek. I said goodbye to everyone else, grabbed my backpack off of the chair, swung it over my shoulder, turned around, and asked, You ready? Isaac, bent completely in half and struggling with his pack, said irritably, I would be if this thing had bigger straps. His S's were slightly slurred and more pronounced than normal because he was in full demon form, and his fangs got in the way of his speech. Laughing softly, I walked over to him and tried to help him with his pack. Maybe if you was smaller, Uncle Isaac, you could get into it, 5-year-old Mindy said, and stuck her thumb into her mouth. She may have a point, Isaac, I said, reaching down and pulling her thumb back out of her mouth. Looking over the straps, I grabbed one and tried to adjust it to a length that would fit over his shoulders. It was no use. The straps just weren't made to go over demon shoulders. Shaking my head, I glanced at him and grimaced in sympathy. He was doubled over completely and had a sour look on his face, though it was hard to tell what expression he had on his face right now, considering it was full demon. He was big in human form, but in full demon form he was 3 times the size a normal man was, and that meant that even if we did get the pack on him, he would still have to shrink to get out of the tent again. Just shift forms again, Isaac, 9-year-old Barnaby said, crossing his arms. Yeah, just shift forms, his twin sister Bailey said, mimicking his pose.